The morning fog rolled across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Crawford stood at his post, his red uniform pressed to perfection, his bearskin hat sitting tall and proud on his head. He had served in the Royal Guard for 12 years, a position he had earned through dedication, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the crown. His father had been a guardsman before him, and his grandfather before that. The Crawford family had protected British royalty for 3 generations, and James wore that legacy like a second skin. That Tuesday morning started like any other. James took his position at the castle's north entrance at precisely 6 o'clock, relieving the night guard with a crisp salute. The autumn air was cool against his face, and the first rays of sunlight began painting the ancient stone walls in shades of gold. Tourists would arrive in a few hours, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the guards or perhaps even a member of the royal family. But for now, the castle grounds belonged to the staff, the security teams, and the handful of guards maintaining their silent vigil. James had always taken his duty seriously. While some of the younger guards occasionally struggled with the rigid stillness required of them, James found peace in it. Standing motionless for hours required a special kind of mental discipline, ability to turn inward while remaining completely aware of your surroundings. He had mastered this art years ago. His mind could wander through memories, plans, and thoughts while his eyes continuously scanned for anything unusual, any potential threat to the royal family he had sworn to protect. Around 10 o'clock that morning, a black car with darkened windows pulled through the castle gates. James recognized it immediately as one of the official vehicles used by senior members of the royal family. His training kicked in automatically, his posture somehow becoming even more rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. The car slowed as it passed his position and through his peripheral vision. James could see someone in the back seat looking in his direction. The vehicle continued toward the main entrance and disappeared from view. James thought nothing of it. Royal family members came and went regularly, and his job was simply to maintain his post with dignity and precision. What he did not know was that King Charles himself had been in that car, and the king had been watching him very carefully. 30 minutes later, James noticed unusual activity near the main entrance. Several senior security officers had gathered, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing in his direction. His stomach tightened slightly, though his expression remained unchanged. In 12 years of service, he had never been the subject of such attention. Had he done something wrong? Had he somehow violated protocol without realizing it? At 11 o'clock, his shift supervisor, Captain Richard Bennett, approached him with an expression James could not quite read. It was somewhere between concern and confusion, with perhaps a hint of sympathy mixed in. "Sergeant Crawford," Captain Bennett said quietly, his voice low enough that nearby tourists could not hear. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Please follow me." James felt his heart skip a beat. Relieved of duty. Those words carried weight, implications that sent his mind racing. In the Royal Guard, being suddenly relieved usually meant one of two things. Either a family emergency had occurred, or you had committed some serious breach of conduct. Since no one had mentioned his family, James feared the worst. "Sir, may I ask what this is regarding?" James managed to keep his voice steady, professional, even as anxiety twisted in his chest. "Not here, Sergeant. Please, just come with me." Captain Bennett's tone was not unkind, but it was firm, leaving no room for discussion. James followed his supervisor through the castle's side entrance. Down corridors he had walked thousands of times, past tapestries and portraits of monarchs long dead. Other staff members they passed seemed to avert their eyes, and James felt a growing sense of dread. Whatever this was about, it was clearly serious enough that word had already spread through the castle staff. They entered a small administrative office, and Captain Bennett closed the door behind them. He gestured for James to sit, but remained standing himself, hands clasped behind his back, in a military posture that James recognized as deeply uncomfortable. "Sergeant Crawford, I want you to understand that this decision did not originate with me, nor with any of your immediate supervisors," Captain Bennett began, choosing his words carefully. "Your service record is exemplary. You have never received a single complaint or disciplinary action. You are, by all accounts, one of our finest guards." James waited, knowing there was a significant however coming. "However," Captain Bennet continued, and there it was. "A decision has been made at the highest level to remove you from active guard duty, effective immediately. You will be placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of your background and family history." "My family history?" James repeated, genuinely confused. "Sir, my family has served the crown for 3 generations. My background checks have always been, I understand, Sergeant, but new information has apparently come to light. Information that requires investigation." Captain Bennet finally sat down, his expression softening slightly. "I cannot tell you more because I honestly do not know more. What I can tell you is that this order came directly from His Majesty himself." The room seemed to tilt slightly. King Charles had personally ordered his removal? James had never even met the king, had never been in a position where the monarch would have reason to notice him specifically. Royal guards were meant to be invisible, interchangeable, part of the scenery. How could he have drawn such direct attention, and why would it result in his suspension? "There must be some mistake," James said, hearing the desperation creeping into his own voice, despite his best efforts to remain professional. "I have done nothing wrong. My loyalty to the crown is absolute. My entire life has been dedicated to this service." "I believe you, Sergeant, but the decision has been made. You will need to surrender your uniform and credentials. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings from the guardhouse, and then you will be required to leave the premises. You will be contacted within the next few days regarding the investigation." James felt numb as he mechanically followed the procedures for being dismissed. He changed out of his uniform in a locker room that suddenly felt foreign to him, pulling on civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame. The red tunic, the polished boots, the bearskin hattle of it, had been part of his identity for so long that removing them felt like peeling away his own skin. The security officer he had known for years, a man named Thomas with whom he had shared countless cups of tea during night shifts, stood waiting to escort him out. Thomas would not meet his eyes, and James understood. In situations like this, guilt by association was a real concern. No one wanted to appear too friendly with someone who had fallen from favor. Not until they knew what the person had supposedly done. The walk to the castle gates felt endless. Staff members and fellow guards watched from windows and doorways, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. James kept his head high, his shoulders back, refusing to show the humiliation and confusion that churned inside him. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that with absolute certainty. Whatever this investigation was about, it would clear his name. It had too, as he passed through the castle gates for what might be the last time. James turned back for one final look at the place that had been his home, his purpose, his entire adult life. The ancient stones seemed to stare back at him, indifferent to his pain. Having witnessed the rise and fall of countless servants over centuries, he was just one more person passing through their long history. James walked to his car in the visitors' parking area, his mind spinning with questions. What new information could possibly have come to light about his family? His background had been thoroughly investigated when he first applied to the Royal Guard. His father and grandfather had both served with honor and distinction. There were no family scandals, no criminal records, no hidden secrets that he knew of. As he sat in his car, unable to quite bring himself to start the engine and drive away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a text message from his mother. "James, we need to talk. It's urgent. Please come to the house as soon as you can. Don't call, just come. This needs to be said in person." His mother's message filled him with a new kind of dread. She knew somehow. She already knew about his suspension. But how? The decision had been made less than 2 hours ago, unless whatever had caused his removal involved his family directly. James started his car and pulled out of the parking area, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The drive to his parents' house in the countryside would take about 40 minutes. 40 minutes for his imagination to run wild with possibilities. Each more troubling than the last, the English countryside blurred past his windows as he drove. the familiar roads offering no comfort. His phone rang twice, calls from fellow guardsmen, no doubt wanting to know what had happened. He ignored them. What could he possibly say when he did not understand it himself? When he finally pulled into his parents' driveway, he noticed both of their cars were there, even though his father should have been at work. His mother was waiting at the front door before he had even turned off his engine, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red as if she had been crying. "Ma'am, what's going on?" James asked as he climbed out of the car. "I was removed from duty today, suspended pending some kind of investigation into our family history. Do you know anything about this?" His mother glanced around nervously, as if worried that someone might be watching or listening, then gestured urgently for him to come inside. "Your father is in the sitting room. We have something we need to tell you, something we should have told you years ago. God forgive us, but we thought we were protecting you." James followed his mother into the house, his sense of unreality growing with each step. The sitting room, usually a warm and welcoming space filled with family photos and his mother's collection of china teacups, felt oddly oppressive today. His father stood by the window, his back to the door, shoulders hunched in a way that made him look older than his 68 years. "Dad," James said, and his father turned slowly, his face etched with an expression of profound regret and something that looked almost like fear. "Sit down, son," his father said quietly. "What we are about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about our family and about yourself." James sank into the familiar armchair where he had sat countless times throughout his childhood. Though nothing about this moment felt familiar, his parents exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of marriage. Seemingly deciding who should begin this conversation neither of them wanted to have, his mother sat down on the sofa, her hands twisting a tissue that was already shredded from nervous handling. His father remained standing, as if sitting would somehow make what they had to say more real, more permanent. "Your grandfather, Edward Crawford," his father began, his voice rough with emotion, "was indeed a member of the Royal Guard, just as we always told you. He served with distinction for nearly 20 years. That part of our family history is true." James waited, sensing the unspoken but that hung in the air between them. "But what we never told you," his father continued, pausing to clear his throat, "was that Edward was not actually a Crawford by birth. He changed his name in 1952, shortly after King George VI died. Before that, his name was Edward Altman." The name meant nothing to James, though he could see from his parents' expressions that it should. "I don't understand. Why would grandfather change his name? And what does this have to do with my suspension?" His mother spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Altman family has a complicated history. During the Second World War, your great-grandfather, Heinrich Altman, worked as a translator for the German embassy in London. When war broke out, he was detained briefly, though he was eventually released because he had lived in England for years and had British citizenship. But the damage to the family name was done. People suspected the Altmans of being Nazi sympathizers, even though there was never any proof of actual wrongdoing." James felt his stomach drop. "Are you telling me our family has Nazi connections?" "No," his father said firmly. "Or at least, nothing was ever proven." Heinrich Altman claimed he was simply doing his job as a translator, that he had no political allegiances to Germany or the Nazi Party. But suspicion clung to the family like a shadow. After the war, it became nearly impossible for anyone named Altman to find decent work, to be trusted in any position of responsibility. Your grandfather Edward, who had been just a teenager during the war, eventually changed his name to his mother's maiden name, Crawford, to escape that stigma. James tried to process this information, to understand why his parents had kept it secret for so long. But if great-grandfather Heinrich was cleared, if there was no evidence against him, then why hide this? Why not just explain the truth? His mother's eyes filled with fresh tears, because the truth is more complicated than that. "James, your great-grandfather may have been officially cleared, but there were always questions, always doubts. Some documents suggested he had done more than just translate, that he had passed information, facilitated communications that may have helped German intelligence. Nothing was ever proven, the evidence was circumstantial at best. But the shadow of doubt remained, and your grandfather Edward," his father added, "spent his entire life trying to prove that his family's loyalty was to Britain, not to Germany. He changed his name. He joined the Royal Guard. He dedicated himself to serving the crown with absolute devotion. He wanted to erase any question about where the family's loyalties lay. James stood up abruptly, pacing across the room as anger began to bubble up through his shock. "So, you let me follow in his footsteps, join the Royal Guard myself, build my entire life around this service, all while hiding this secret. Did it never occur to you that it might come out eventually? That it might destroy everything I have worked for?" "We thought enough time had passed," his mother said desperately. "Edward served for 20 years without anyone discovering the truth. Your father served for 15 years. You have been there for 12. We thought the secret was buried deeply enough that it would never surface. We thought we had left that dark chapter behind us forever." "Then how did King Charles find out?" James demanded. "Background checks would have revealed any name changes. They would have seen that grandfather changed his name from Altman to Crawford." His parents exchanged another meaningful glance, and James realized there was more they had not told him yet. His father walked over to a drawer in the antique desk that had belonged to Edward Crawford, pulling out a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been handled many times over the years. "Your grandfather left this letter to be opened only if the truth about the Altman family ever came to light. He died thinking that would never happen, but he wanted to leave a full account just in case. I read it after he passed away, and I've carried the burden of its contents ever since." He handed the envelope to James, who took it with trembling hands. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at any moment. Inside was a letter written in his grandfather's careful, precise handwriting. Dated just a few months before Edward Crawford had died of a heart attack in 1998, James began to read. The world he thought he knew continued to crumble around him. "To whoever reads this letter," his grandfather had written, "I write this as a confession, a unburdening of a secret I've carried for more than 40 years. My father, Heinrich Altman, was not simply a translator for the German embassy. That was his official position, but his real role was far more significant and far more damaging to the British crown than anyone ever discovered." James looked up at his parents. "What does he mean?" "Keep reading," his father said quietly. The letter continued. "My father was recruited by German intelligence in 1938, before the war even began. He was asked to cultivate relationships with staff members at Buckingham Palace, to gather information about the royal family's movements, their private conversations, their relationships with government officials. He was what we would now call a spy, though at the time he justified it to himself as simply reporting on public figures whose actions affected international relations." James felt sick. His great-grandfather had been a German spy operating within reach of the British royal family. During the war, the letter went on, my father's information gathering became more focused, more urgent. He was specifically tasked with understanding the movements and plans of King George VI and the royal family. The Germans were interested in anything that might give them leverage, anything that might sow discord within the British leadership. My father passed along countless pieces of information, some trivial, some potentially quite damaging, until his detention in 1940 made further espionage impossible. When the war ended, my father destroyed all evidence of his activities. He had been careful, using intermediaries and coded messages. The British investigators found nothing concrete to link him to espionage. But he lived the rest of his life knowing what he had done, and that knowledge ate away at him until his death in 1965. I have carried the shame of this knowledge my entire adult life. I changed my name not just to escape suspicion, but to try to become someone new, someone untainted by my father's betrayal. I joined the Royal Guard to prove to myself more than anyone that the Crawford family served the crown, not foreign powers. Every day I stood at my post, I was making amends for sins that were not mine, but that I inherited nonetheless. The letter concluded, "If this truth ever comes to light, I hope whoever reads this will understand that I tried to make things right. I served with honor. I raised my son to serve with honor. I hoped that would be enough to balance the scales, to erase the stain on our family name. I suppose I will never know if I succeeded." James set the letter down, his hands shaking. How did King Charles discover this? How did any of this come to light after all these years? His father sat down heavily, suddenly looking exhausted. 2 weeks ago, a historian researching British intelligence operations during World War II discovered a cache of documents that had been misfiled in the National Archives. Among them were reports from German intelligence handlers discussing their agents in London. Heinrich Altmann's code name appeared in several documents, along with summaries of the information he had provided. The historian contacted the Home Office, who began cross-referencing the information. When they discovered that Heinrich Altmann had a descendant currently serving in the Royal Guard, his mother added, they immediately notified Buckingham Palace. The security services launched a quiet investigation into our family, looking for any sign that the espionage might have continued through subsequent generations. They found nothing, of course, because there is nothing to find. But the fact remains that your great-grandfather betrayed the crown, and you are his direct descendant, serving in one of the most sensitive security positions in the country. James felt the walls closing in around him. His entire life had been built on a foundation of service and loyalty, and now he was being punished for crimes committed by a man he had never met. A man who had died nearly 2 decades before James was even born. The injustice of it burned in his chest. So that is it then, James said bitterly. My career is over because of something my great-grandfather did 80 years ago. I am to be punished for his sins. We do not know yet, his father said. The investigation is ongoing. They are trying to determine whether the Altmann connection poses any security risk. In truth, it probably does not. You have been thoroughly vetted. You have served impeccably. There is no evidence that you or I or your grandfather Edward were anything but loyal British subjects. But the royal family is cautious, understandably so, given what Heinrich did. There is more, his mother said hesitantly. When the security services were investigating our family history, they discovered something else. Something that even your grandfather's letter did not mention, because he may not have known about it himself. James could not imagine what else there could possibly be. What other revelations this nightmare day could hold. Heinrich Altmann, his mother continued, had access to some of the royal family's most private information during his time gathering intelligence. Among the information he collected and passed along to his German handlers were details about the royal family's personal relationships, including some matters that were considered extremely sensitive at the time and have remained secret to this day. What kind of matters? James asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. His mother took a deep breath. There were rumors, never confirmed, but persistent, about certain members of the extended royal family having connections to German aristocracy that went beyond mere diplomatic relations. Some of these connections were romantic in nature, some were financial, and some were potentially politically compromising. Heinrich had documented evidence of at least some of these connections. Information that could have been deeply embarrassing to the crown if it had been made public during wartime. James began to understand. And now that evidence might still exist somewhere? In German archives, perhaps? That is what concerns the royal family, his father confirmed. If Heinrich's reports to his German handlers still exist in some archive in Germany or elsewhere, they could contain information that the royal family would very much prefer remain secret, even all these years later. Some secrets never lose their power to damage James. Some truths are considered too sensitive to ever come fully to light. And they think I might know something about these secrets. James said incredulously, I am 4 generations removed from Heinrich Altmann. How could I possibly have information about wartime intelligence reports? They do not necessarily think you have the information itself, his mother said. But they wonder if your family might have kept other documents, other evidence that Heinrich possessed. When your grandfather Edward died, did he leave behind any papers, any documents that might relate to his father's activities? James thought about the boxes of his grandfather's belongings that were still stored in his parents' attic, mostly old photographs and military memorabilia from Edward's time in the Royal Guard. He had never had reason to look through them carefully, had never imagined they might contain anything significant. I do not know, James admitted. I have never really gone through grandfather's things. I always meant to, but there never seemed to be a rush. His father stood up with a grim expression. Well, there's a rush now. The security services will almost certainly request access to anything Edward left behind. But before we turn anything over to them, I think we need to look ourselves. We need to know what we are dealing with. What secrets might still be hiding in our family's past? The three of them climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a space James had not entered in years. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through a small window, and the air smelled of old paper and forgotten memories. In the far corner sat several cardboard boxes marked with Edward Crawford's name. The cardboard yellowed and brittle with age. They worked in silence, carefully going through each box, examining every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper that might hold a clue to Heinrich Altman's secrets. Most of it was mundane old guard schedules, commendations for Edward's service, family photographs from happier times. But in the bottom of the last box, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers, James found something that made his blood run cold. The oilcloth was heavy, preserved carefully as if the contents were precious. When James carefully unwrapped it, he found a leather-bound journal. Its pages yellowed but still intact, along with several loose documents that appeared to be copies of official correspondence from the 1940s. The journal was written in German, which James could not read fluently. Even his limited knowledge of the language was enough to recognize certain words that appeared repeatedly: Königliche family, meaning royal family, and Geheimnis, meaning secret. James's mother, who had studied German in university, took the journal with trembling hands and began to flip through its pages, her eyes scanning the careful handwriting that filled each page. As she read, her face grew paler, and after several minutes, she closed the journal abruptly, as if she could not bear to read any more. "This is Heinrich's diary," she said, her voice hollow. "He documented everything, every piece of information he gathered, every conversation he overheard or was told about, every secret he uncovered about the royal family during the years he was active as an intelligence asset. James, this is exactly what the security services are afraid exists. This is a detailed record of information that could still cause immense embarrassment to the crown." Even 80 years later, James's father took the journal from her, reading several passages himself before looking up at his son with an expression of deep concern. "Some of what is written here concerns relationships within the extended royal family that were never publicly acknowledged. There are details about financial arrangements that would raise questions about how certain members of the royal family maintained their wealth during the war years. And there are references to political sympathies among some minor royals that would be problematic, to say the least, if they became public knowledge." "Are you saying that some members of the royal family had Nazi sympathies?" James asked, feeling like he was tumbling down a rabbit hole with no bottom. "Not exactly," his father hedged. "You have to understand the context of the times. Before the war, many British aristocrats, including some distant members of the royal family, saw Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism. They attended social events with German officials, maintained friendships with German aristocrats, and some even expressed admiration for certain aspects of the German government's policies. Once the war began, most of these people firmly sided with Britain, but their earlier associations were a source of potential embarrassment." Heinrich documented all of this, James's mother added. "He recorded conversations, meetings, financial transactions, personal relationships. Some of it is merely gossipy and embarrassing, but some of it could be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty or improper conduct by people connected to the royal family." James took the journal from his father, handling it carefully as if it were a live explosive, which in some ways it was. "So grandfather Edward kept this diary all these years? Why did he not destroy it? Why risk having this information discovered?" His father shook his head slowly. "I do not think Edward knew it existed. Heinrich must have hidden it before his death in 1965. And Edward only discovered it years later when he was going through his father's belongings. By the time Edward found it, so many years had passed that destroying it might have seemed more suspicious than keeping it hidden. Or perhaps he kept it as a form of insurance, evidence that could exonerate the family if needed. Proof that Heinrich had only been a low-level intelligence asset and not a major spy." Or perhaps James's mother suggested quietly. He kept it because destroying it would have meant losing the last tangible connection to his father. Despite everything Heinrich had done, family loyalty is a complicated thing, James. even when our relatives have done terrible things. We do not always find it easy to completely erase them from our lives. James sat down on an old trunk, the journal heavy in his hands as he tried to work through the implications of what they had found. If I turn this over to the security services, it will confirm all their worst fears about our family. They will see that we have been sitting on explosive information about the royal family for decades. It will look like we were deliberately hiding it, maybe even planning to use it somehow. But if we do not turn it over, his father countered, and they discover we found it and kept it secret, that will be even worse. That would look like active concealment, possibly even blackmail material. We would go from being the descendants of a wartime spy to being potential blackmailers ourselves. The three of them sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the remnants of their family's past, each lost in their own troubled thoughts. The silence stretched on until James's phone suddenly rang, the sound jarring in the quiet space. He pulled it from his pocket to see an unfamiliar number with a London area code. "Sergeant Crawford," a crisp, professional voice said when James answered. "This is Margaret Thornton from His Majesty's private office. I'm calling to inform you that King Charles would like to meet with you personally tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at Buckingham Palace. This is not a request that can be declined. You will come alone, and you will discuss this matter with no one before the meeting. Do you understand?" James felt his mouth go dry. A direct summons from the king himself was unprecedented, especially for a suspended guard under investigation. "Yes, I understand. I will be there." "Good. You will be met at the garden entrance. Do not be late." The line went dead. James looked at his parents, who had overheard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. "King Charles wants to meet with me tomorrow morning. Just me, no one else." His mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, James, what do you think he wants?" "I think he wants to know what we know," James said slowly. "I think he wants to know if our family has been sitting on information. That could damage the crown, and I think he wants to assess whether I am a security risk or just an unfortunate descendant of someone who made terrible choices 80 years ago." His father stood up, his military bearing reasserting itself despite his age. "Then you need to be completely honest with him. James, you need to tell him about this journal, about everything we have found today. Trying to hide it or downplay it will only make things worse. The king needs to know that you have nothing to hide, that your loyalty is absolute, and that you are willing to turn over anything that might be relevant to his security concerns." "But if I tell him about the journal," James protested, "I am essentially confirming that our family has been in possession of sensitive information about the royal family for decades. How does that not make me look guilty of something?" "Because honesty is your only option," his mother said firmly. "Your great-grandfather Heinrich made choices that have haunted this family for 3 generations. Your grandfather Edward spent his entire life trying to make amends for those choices. Now it is your turn to deal with the consequences of Heinrich's actions. But you can do it with integrity, with honesty, and with the same dedication to duty that has defined your service until now." James knew they were right, but the thought of facing King Charles, of having to explain his family's dark history to the very person who had every right to feel betrayed by the Altman legacy, filled him with dread. How did you look a monarch in the eye and explain that your great-grandfather had spied on his great-grandparents? How did you convince someone that you were not your ancestors' crimes? That evening, James barely slept. He lay in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what he would say to King Charles. He thought about his grandfather Edward, who had stood at his post day after day, year after year, trying to prove through his service that the Crawford family was loyal, that they could be trusted. All of that effort, all of that dedication had come crashing down because of documents hidden in an attic, waiting like a ticking bomb to explode and destroy everything Edward had built. When dawn finally broke, James rose and dressed carefully in his best suit. He would not be wearing his royal guard uniform today. That privilege had been suspended along with his duties, but he could still present himself with military precision. He retrieved the journal from where he had carefully stored it the night before, wrapped it again in its oilcloth, and placed it in a leather satchel along with the loose documents they had found with it. The drive into London felt surreal. Traffic moved at its usual pace. People went about their morning routines, completely unaware that James's entire world was balanced on a knife edge. He parked several blocks from Buckingham Palace and walked the rest of the way, needing the time to compose himself, to gather his thoughts and his courage. At precisely 10 o'clock, James presented himself at the garden entrance, as instructed. A security officer he did not recognize checked his identification and used a radio to confirm his arrival. Within minutes, Margaret Thornton appeared, a slender woman in her 50s wearing a conservative gray suit and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing about what she might be thinking. "Sergeant Crawford, please follow me," she said without preamble, turning on her heel and walking briskly into the palace. James followed her through a series of corridors that he had never seen during his service as a guard. These were the private areas of the palace, the rooms and hallways where the royal family actually lived and worked. Far from the ceremonial spaces that tourists occasionally glimpsed, the walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, and James felt their painted eyes following him as he passed, judging him for the sins of his great-grandfather. They arrived at a door that Margaret knocked on gently before opening. "Sergeant Crawford, Your Majesty," she announced, then stepped aside to let James enter. The room was smaller and more intimate than James had expected, furnished more like a comfortable study than a formal royal receiving room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, fireplace burned gently on a third, and large windows overlooking the palace gardens occupied the fourth. And standing by those windows, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that somehow reminded James of his own father, was King Charles. The king turned as James entered, and for a long moment the two men simply looked at each other. James had seen the king countless times, of course, during ceremonies and official events, but he had never been this close, had never been the sole focus of the monarch's attention. Charles was older than he appeared in photographs, the lines around his eyes deeper, his expression carrying the weight of responsibilities that James could only imagine. "Your Majesty," James said, bowing his head respectfully. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Sergeant Crawford," the king replied, his voice measured and thoughtful. "Or should I say Sergeant Altman? That is the question at the heart of this matter, is it not? Who are you really? Are you the loyal guardsman you appear to be? Or are you your great-grandfather's legacy, a potential threat lurking within my own security detail?" James felt the sting of those words, but forced himself to maintain his composure. "I am James Crawford, Your Majesty. I am the man who has served the crown faithfully for 12 years. I cannot deny my family history, nor would I try to, but I can assure you that I am not my great-grandfather. His choices were his own, not mine." King Charles walked over to a pair of chairs near the fireplace and gestured for James to sit. "I have read your service record, Sergeant. It is, as I am sure you know, impeccable. You have never given anyone reason to question your loyalty or your dedication, which makes this situation all the more difficult, because I find myself having to question you not because of anything you have done, but because of who you are descended from. I understand." "Your Majesty," James said, sitting carefully on the edge of the chair, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, "and I want you to know that I have something to show you, something that was hidden in my family's possession, something that I only discovered yesterday." James opened his satchel and carefully removed the oilcloth bundle, placing it on the small table between them. "This is Heinrich Altman's personal journal from his time working as a German intelligence asset. My grandfather Edward apparently found it among Heinrich's belongings after his death and kept it hidden all these years. I do not know why he did not destroy it, but I found it yesterday while searching through his old possessions." King Charles leaned forward, staring at the bundle but not yet touching it. "And have you read this journal, Sergeant? Do you know what it contains?" "My mother translated some of it for me, Your Majesty. It contains detailed information about members of the royal family from the war years, including some matters that are quite sensitive. I think this journal is exactly what your security services feared might exist somewhere, a detailed record of information that could still cause embarrassment or worse if it became public." The king was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the journal to James's face and back again. You realize that by bringing this to me, you are confirming that your family has been in possession of potentially damaging information about the royal family for decades? You understand how that looks? Yes, Your Majesty, I do, James replied. But I also understand that hiding it or destroying it would be far worse. My grandfather Edward spent his entire life trying to prove his loyalty to the crown despite his father's betrayal. I want to honor that by being completely honest with you now. I am not hiding anything. I am not holding anything back. This journal, and whatever secrets it contains, belongs to you now. You can decide what to do with it. King Charles carefully unwrapped the oilcloth and picked up the journal, handling it with the reverence one might give to an ancient artifact, which in many ways it was. He opened it to a random page and scanned the German text, his expression growing more troubled with each line he read. After several minutes, he closed the journal and set it back down on the table. This is indeed what we feared existed, the king said quietly. My great-uncle's name is mentioned here, along with details about meetings he attended in the late 1930s with certain German officials. There are also references to financial matters that would raise uncomfortable questions about how some members of the extended royal family maintained their lifestyle during the war years. And there are personal matters, relationships, and indiscretions that we would very much prefer remain private. I understand, Your Majesty, James said. I want you to know that neither I, nor my father, nor my grandfather ever intended to use this information against you or your family. We have kept it hidden precisely because we understood how damaging it could be if it became public. We have spent 3 generations trying to make amends for Heinrich's betrayal. Not profiting from it or exploiting it, King Charles leaned back in his chair, studying James with an intensity that was both uncomfortable and oddly reassuring. The king was not simply going through the motions of this interview, he was genuinely trying to understand, to assess, to determine whether James Crawford was a man he could trust. Tell me about your service. Sergeant, the king said, his tone shifting slightly. Not the official record, which I have already read, but what it means to you personally. Why did you join the Royal Guard? Why dedicate your life to protecting people you have never met, people who live in a world so different from your own? James took a moment to gather his thoughts, realizing that this was the real test. The king did not just want to know about the journal or the family secrets. He wanted to understand James's character, his motivations, his heart. My grandfather Edward told me stories when I was growing up, James began. He never spoke about his father, about Heinrich. But he talked endlessly about his time in the Royal Guard. He described standing at his post, watching the world go by, knowing that he was part of something larger than himself, something that connected him to centuries of tradition and service. He said that being a Royal Guard was not about the person wearing the crown, but about what the crown represented: continuity, stability, the idea that some things remain constant even when the world is changing around us. James paused, choosing his words carefully. I think now that those stories were his way of trying to convince himself that he had made the right choice, that his service mattered despite the shadow of his father's betrayal. But when he told me those stories, I did not know any of that history. I just saw a man who was proud of what he had done, who felt that his service had given his life meaning and purpose. So you joined to honor him, the king observed. Partly, James admitted, but also because I wanted to feel what he felt, that sense of being part of something enduring and important. In our modern world, so much is temporary, disposable, constantly changing. But the Royal Guard has stood watch over British monarchs for centuries. When I put on that uniform for the first time, I felt connected to all the guardsmen who had come before me, all the way back through history. It was like being part of an unbroken chain stretching back through time. King Charles nodded slowly, a slight smile touching the corners of his mouth. I understand that feeling more than you might imagine, Sergeant. I, too, am part of an unbroken chain, though mine is perhaps even longer and more burdensome than yours. Every decision I make, every action I take, is weighed against the actions of monarchs who came before me. Judged against a standard set by centuries of tradition, the king stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the gardens below. When I learned about your family history, about Heinrich Altmann's activities during the war, My initial instinct was to remove you immediately and permanently from any position of trust or responsibility. How could I allow the great-grandson of a German spy to serve in my personal security detail? What message would that send about the vigilance of our security services? James felt his heart sink, sensing that despite his honesty, despite bringing the journal forward, the answer was still going to be no. He would never be allowed back into the royal guard. But then the king turned back to face him, and his expression was softer now, more contemplative. However, I then read more carefully about your grandfather, Edward. I read about his exemplary service record, about the commendations he received, about the respect his fellow guardsmen had for him, and I thought about what it must have taken for him to put on that uniform every day. Knowing that he was the son of a man who had betrayed the very institution he was sworn to protect, that took courage, Sergeant Crawford. That took a strength of character that goes beyond simple duty or obligation. Your grandfather could have walked away from any association with the crown, could have built a life far removed from the royal family. Instead, he spent 20 years standing at attention, proving through his actions that he was more than his father's son. The king walked back over to his chair and sat down again, his gaze never leaving James's face. And now you come to me, voluntarily bringing me evidence that could have remained hidden. Information that puts your family in an even more difficult position. You could have destroyed this journal, claimed ignorance, made my investigation far more difficult. But instead, you are here offering me complete transparency, asking for nothing except the chance to prove that you are who you claim to be. James held his breath, hardly daring to hope that this conversation might be going somewhere other than where he had feared. I believe you, Sergeant Crawford, King Charles said. I believe that you are not your great-grandfather, that you are a man of honor and integrity who has been unfairly burdened by the sins of an ancestor you never knew. I believe that your loyalty to the crown is genuine and that your service has been exemplary. Relief flooded through James, so intense that he felt almost dizzy. Thank you, Your Majesty. That means more to me than I can express. However, the king continued, and James braced himself for the inevitable qualification. I cannot simply restore you to active duty as if nothing has happened. The security concerns are real, and they must be addressed properly. You will remain on administrative leave while a complete review of your background and your family history is conducted. This journal will be examined by historians and security experts to determine what information it contains and whether any of it poses an ongoing security risk. I understand. Your Majesty, James said, trying not to let his disappointment show. But I want you to know, the king added, his voice warming slightly, that I will personally follow this review process. I will ensure that you are treated fairly, that the investigation focuses on legitimate security concerns rather than punishing you for your ancestry. And assuming the review concludes, what I expect it to conclude that you pose no security risk and that your loyalty is beyond question, then you will be reinstated. To your position in the Royal Guard, James felt hope rekindling in his chest. It was not a complete victory, not yet, but it was far more than he had dared to hope for when he had walked into this room. There is one more thing, Sergeant, the king said, picking up the journal again. This document contains information about my family that is deeply sensitive. Some of it is merely embarrassing, but some of it could be genuinely damaging if it became public. I need to know that I can trust you and your family to never speak of what is written here, never to hint at it or reference it, even obliquely. Can you give me your word on that? You have my word, Your Majesty, James said immediately, and you have my father's word as well. We have kept these secrets for 3 generations, not because we were planning to use them, but because we understood that some things are too damaging to ever reveal. That has not changed, and it will not change. King Charles studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Very well. I will have my private secretary contact you within the week regarding the formal review process. In the meantime, you are to discuss this matter with no one outside your immediate family. The fewer people who know about this journal and its contents, the better for everyone involved. I understand, Your Majesty. James stood, recognizing that the audience was coming to an end. Thank you for your understanding, and for your willingness to judge me on my own actions rather than my great-grandfather's mistakes, Sergeant Crawford, the king said. Also standing, we are none of us responsible for the sins of our ancestors. But we are all responsible for how we respond to those sins when they come to light. You have responded with honor and integrity, and that speaks well of you. Your grandfather Edward would be proud. Those words, more than anything else that had been said during their meeting, hit James with unexpected emotional force. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the standard his grandfather had set, trying to be worthy of the legacy Edward Crawford had worked so hard to build. To hear the king himself say that Edward would be proud felt like a validation of everything James had tried to be. "Thank you, Your Majesty," James managed, his voice rough with emotion. "That means everything to me." Margaret Thornton appeared at the door to escort James out, and he followed her back through the private corridors of the palace, back toward the world outside where people went about their normal lives, unaware of the secret histories and hidden dramas playing out behind palace walls. As James walked back to his car, the weight that had been pressing down on him since his suspension began to lift slightly. The outcome was still uncertain. The investigation would still take time. But he had been honest, and the king had believed him. That was more than he had any right to expect. Over the following weeks, James went through the most thorough background investigation he had ever experienced. Security services interviewed everyone he had ever worked with, every teacher he had ever had, every friend he had maintained contact with over the years. They examined his financial records, his communications, his movements. They looked for any sign that he might be a security risk, any hint that he had been influenced by his great-grandfather's legacy. Meanwhile, historians and intelligence analysts examined Heinrich Altmann's journal in minute detail. They cross-referenced the information it contained with other historical records, trying to determine what was accurate and what might have been exaggerated or misunderstood by Heinrich. Some of what they found was indeed sensitive and would remain classified. But much of it was information that had already become public knowledge over the decades since the war, diminishing its explosive potential. 6 weeks after his meeting with King Charles, James received a letter on official palace stationery. With trembling hands, he opened it and read the formal notification that his security clearance had been fully reinstated. The investigation had found no evidence that he posed any security risk to the royal family. He was authorized to return to active duty in the Royal Guard effective immediately, if he wished to do so. The final paragraph of the letter was handwritten, clearly added by King Charles himself. "Sergeant Crawford, your family story is a reminder that the past is never truly past, but neither is it destiny. Your grandfather made a choice to serve with honor despite his father's betrayal. You have made that same choice. The Crown is grateful for your service and your integrity. Welcome back." James returned to Windsor Castle the following Monday morning, putting on his red uniform with a mixture of pride and relief that he had never experienced before. His fellow guardsmen welcomed him back without fanfare, accepting him as they always had, as one of their own. Most of them never knew the real reason for his suspension, and James was content to keep it that way. But as he took his post at the castle's north entrance, standing at attention as he had done countless times before, James felt different somehow. He carried with him now a deeper understanding of what service meant, what loyalty required. It was not just about standing at your post or following orders. It was about choosing every day to be better than your worst impulses, better than the darkest parts of your heritage. His great-grandfather Heinrich had made choices that brought shame to their family. His grandfather Edward had spent a lifetime trying to erase that shame through honorable service. His father had carried the burden of that secret history without letting it embitter him. And now it was James's turn to carry forward the Crawford legacy, knowing its full weight, understanding its complexity, but committed nonetheless to serving with the same dedication that had defined his grandfather's life. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky and tourists began to arrive with their cameras and excited chatter, James stood motionless at his post, a re-uniformed sentinel protecting a institution that had endured for centuries. He was aware, as he had never been before, that he was not just guarding a building or even a family. He was guarding an idea, the idea that service matters, that honor matters. That we are defined not by where we come from, but by the choices we make every single day. In his pocket, carefully folded, was the handwritten note from King Charles. James would keep it always, reminder of the day he had faced the consequences of his family's darkest secret and emerged with his integrity intact. Some secrets, he had learned, have the power to destroy. But some secrets, when handled with honesty and courage, have the power to redeem. The difference lay not in the secrets themselves, but in how you chose to carry them forward into the light.